The moment Evelyn Covington stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, she did what she had always done. She made herself smaller. She pulled her shawl tighter across her narrow shoulders, tucked her chin down so the wide brim of her sun-faded bonnet shielded her face from curious eyes, and pressed herself against the side of the coach, while the other passengers spilled outward with noise and laughter and the confident occupation of space. She was 24 years old and had been practicing the art of disappearing for as long as she could remember. It was not a talent she was proud of. It was simply the skill that had kept her alive. The town of Harlan's Crossing was not much to look at. A single main street carved out of red dust and stubbornness, lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon that seemed to lean slightly to the left as though it too had grown weary of standing upright, a small church with peeling white paint, and a scattering of other buildings that represented the full ambition of the settlement. Beyond the town, the land stretched away in all directions in that enormous, indifferent way the New Mexico Territory had, all ochre mesas and pale sky, and the kind of silence that either freed a person or frightened them half to death. Evelyn was somewhere in between. She had come here from Missouri with a single trunk, $12 sewn into the hem of her dress, and an advertisement clipped from a newspaper. The advertisement had read simply, "Housekeeper wanted, Harlan's Crossing Ranch, steady work, honest wage, inquire at the post office upon arrival." And she had thought, reading it alone in the boarding house room she could barely afford, that steady work and an honest wage were two things she had almost never had, and that perhaps the distance between Missouri and New Mexico was exactly the kind of distance she needed between herself and the life she was leaving behind. She had not told anyone she was going. There was no one to tell, not really. Her mother had died 4 years prior, worn down by a husband who treated her like furniture he had grown tired of. Her father was still alive, which she considered one of the greater injustices of the universe. He was the reason she had learned to make herself small. He was loud where she was quiet, large where she was slight, all thunderous disapproval and heavy hands, and the particular cruelty of a man who believed that owning something meant he could treat it however he liked. She had spent her girlhood learning which floorboards creaked and which hours of the day were safe, learning to answer questions with the shortest possible words, learning to want nothing out loud because wanting things out loud had a way of becoming dangerous. She had carried those lessons into her adult life like stones in her pockets. A brief and terrible marriage at 19 to a man who had seemed gentle during the courtship and revealed his true nature the week after the wedding. She had left him after 2 years, which in 1880 was not the simple thing it might have been in another time and place. Women did not simply leave. Women endured or they disappeared, and Evelyn had chosen the latter with the grim efficiency of someone who had been practicing disappearing her whole life. She had worked as a seamstress, as a laundress, as a kitchen helper in a hotel, always in the background, always careful not to draw too much attention, always making herself useful enough to keep but unremarkable enough that no one thought too deeply about her. She was tired. Not in her body exactly, though her body was tired too, but in the place behind her sternum where hope used to live and had been gradually replaced by a careful, quiet endurance. So she had come to Harlan's Crossing. The post office was run by a woman named Mrs. Delphine Marsh, who was approximately 60 years old, shaped like a barrel, and possessed of an expression that managed to be both severe and kindly at once, the way certain grandmothers manage. She looked at Evelyn over the tops of her spectacles when Evelyn pushed open the door and asked about the housekeeper advertisement. "You the one from Missouri?" Mrs. Marsh asked. "Yes, ma'am. Evelyn Covington." Mrs. Marsh studied her for a long moment in the assessing way of someone who had seen many people come and go through a small town and had developed opinions about human nature accordingly. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly. "It was a long journey," Evelyn said. "It always is, Mrs. Marsh reached under the counter and produced a folded piece of paper. Abbott Ranch is 6 miles east of town. Cyrus Abbott runs it. He's got the ranch and about 400 head of cattle and a house that has been without proper management since his mother passed 18 months ago. He's a decent man, she added, with the particular emphasis of someone providing a character reference they meant sincerely. Firm but fair. He won't bother you. Evelyn took the paper, which contained directions to the ranch. How old is he? 28, 29 come October. Mrs. Marsh watched her. He's not looking for a wife if that's what you're wondering, just a housekeeper. Someone to manage the house so he can manage the cattle. That suits me perfectly, Evelyn said, and meant it. The ranch was reached by a wagon track that cut east through scrubland dotted with juniper and pinon pine. A man from the livery, old and whiskered, drove her out in a buckboard with her trunk rattling in the bed. The land was beautiful in the way that hard things sometimes are, all austerity and light. The sky a particular shade of blue that Evelyn had never seen in Missouri, deeper and wider, and somehow more serious. The Abbott Ranch house was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. It was a solid adobe structure, thick-walled and low-roofed in the New Mexico way, with a covered porch running along the front and a large barn set back to the east. There were corrals beyond the barn where several horses stood in the afternoon heat with their heads down. The whole place had the look of something well-built and well-maintained in its fundamental structure, but somewhat in need of attention in its details. The porch needed sweeping. The windows needed washing. The garden plot to the side of the house had gone mostly to weeds. Cyrus Abbott was standing at the corral fence when the buckboard pulled up, apparently in conversation with another man about one of the horses. He turned at the sound of wheels and walked toward the house, and Evelyn had her first look at him. He was tall and broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done physical work all their lives, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a jaw that suggested both stubbornness and something more complicated. He wore working clothes, dusty and practical, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man comfortable in his own landscape. His face was angular and weathered, not classically handsome, but the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He was perhaps the most self-possessed person Evelyn had ever seen. He took up exactly as much space as he occupied and seemed to feel no need to take up more or less. She found this unsettling in a way she could not immediately name. He reached the buckboard and looked up at her with dark brown eyes. "Miss Covington." "Yes, Mr. Abbott. Welcome to the ranch." He held up a hand to help her down from the buckboard, and she took it briefly because to refuse would have been odd, though she was accustomed to managing descents and ascents entirely on her own. His hand was rough and warm, and she released it the moment her feet touched the ground. "Mrs. Marsh wrote that you'd worked as a housekeeper before." "Among other things," Evelyn said. "I'm capable with a kitchen and a garden, with laundry and mending, with keeping accounts if needed." He nodded slowly, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not assessment exactly, or not only assessment, something more careful. "The pay is $8 a month plus room and board. Your room is at the back of the house. It has its own door to the outside." He said this last part in a tone that made clear he understood that a woman working in a man's house, in 1882, in a territory that was only 4 years from becoming a state, might find it important to have an exit of her own. It was a small thing, but it registered with her precisely because small things had always been the things that mattered most. "That's acceptable," she said. "Good." He reached into the buckboard for her trunk and she moved to help, and he shook his head once. "I have it." She stood back and watched him carry it toward the house and thought, he is either the most straightforward man she had ever encountered or the most carefully constructed one. She was not yet sure which. The inside of the house was clean in the way of a place that gets swept and tidied by a person who has the time but not the inclination. Everything was functional and nothing was wasteful, but the details that made a house livable, the small touches of comfort and warmth, had been missing for some time. The curtains were plain and faded. The kitchen was well equipped but had the slight disorder of a man cooking alone. The main room held a table, several chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves of books that surprised her because she had not expected books. She stood in front of the shelves while Cyrus set her trunk in the back room, running her fingers along the spines. History mostly, some natural philosophy, a Bible, a worn copy of Don Quixote, a surveying manual. You read. His voice came from behind her and she turned to find him leaning in the doorway, arms folded, watching her with that same careful expression. Yes, she said. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's a relief. The last housekeeper I tried to hire couldn't read the supply lists. He straightened and moved into the kitchen. I'll leave you to get settled. Supper is usually at 6. I'll be at the barn until then. And that was how it began. The first week was a careful negotiation of space and habit. Evelyn learned the house the way she had learned every environment she had ever occupied, methodically, thoroughly, mapping the territories and their meanings. The kitchen was his domain in the mornings, when he woke before dawn and made his own coffee in a battered tin pot and took it out to the porch to drink alone before the day's work began. She waited until she heard him leave before she came into the kitchen to begin the day's bread. The main room was shared and neutral. The bookshelves, she understood without being told, were available to her. Her room at the back was entirely her own, and she kept it with the spare tidiness of someone accustomed to being ready to leave at any moment. She reorganized the kitchen, which she could tell pleased him even though he said nothing about it, because afterward he stopped that small, frustrated pause he had every evening when reaching for something and finding it in the wrong place. Now everything was where it should logically be and the pause disappeared. She cleared the garden of weeds and planted the kitchen herbs that the previous order had let die. She washed the curtains and rehung them. She went through the household accounts, which had been managed adequately but not well, and found 3 places where they were paying more than necessary for supplies that could be sourced cheaper from the general store if you bought in larger quantities and negotiated. She put together a note of her findings and left it on the kitchen table one morning before he came in for breakfast. He came to find her in the garden that afternoon. She was on her knees pulling bindweed from between the young onion shoots, and she heard his boots on the hard earth and looked up. You found 40 cents a month in savings, he said, holding her note. Closer to 60 cents if you switch your flour supplier. He looked at the note, then at her. Where did you learn accounting? She sat back on her heels and looked up at him in the bright afternoon light. I've managed on very little for a long time, she said. You learned to find every possible saving. Something moved across his face, not pity, which she would have disliked, something more like recognition. I'll make the changes, he said. Thank you. It's what you're paying me for, she said, and turned back to her weeding. She heard him stand there for another moment before his boots moved away, and she bent over the garden and felt, in a way she did not fully understand, as though something small and significant had just occurred. The ranch had 3 other regular workers. Tom Bauer was the foreman, a lean, quiet man in his 40s with a gray mustache and steady eyes, who treated Evelyn with the impersonal courtesy of a man who had learned manners the old-fashioned way and applied them equally to everyone. There were 2 younger ranch hands, brothers named Diego and Luis Salazar, who were perhaps 20 and 22 respectively, and who had grown up in the territory when it was still contested ground, sons of a Mexican family who had ranched this land before the American settlers came, and who had, through the complicated negotiations of survival and practicality, stayed on and found a place in the new order even when the new order did not always make room for them graciously. Evelyn understood this, in the particular way of someone who had also learned to find the narrow spaces where they were permitted to exist. She made sure there was food for all of them, not just Cyrus. She made sure the coffee was always hot when the work crews came in. She did not make a production of it, but she made sure. Diego noticed first. He came in one afternoon to find a fresh corn cake sitting on the kitchen table with a cloth over it, and he looked at Evelyn with something like surprised warmth. "That for us?" he asked. "It would go to waste otherwise," she said, which was not entirely true because it would have kept perfectly well until supper. He smiled. She went back to her work. Tom Bauer found her on the porch one evening, 2 weeks in, as the sun was going down over the mesas in its extraordinary southwestern way, all amber and rose and the particular quality of light that made the ordinary world look briefly consecrated. She was sitting in one of the porch chairs with a piece of mending in her lap, and he stopped at the porch steps and took off his hat. "Evening, Miss Covington. Mind if I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How are you finding it here, I mean?" "The territory takes some getting used to." She set down her mending and considered the question honestly, which she was not always in the habit of doing. "It's very quiet," she said. "Does that suit you?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "Yes, I think it does." Tom nodded, seeming satisfied with this. "He's a good man," he said, the same way Mrs. Marsh had said it, with the same weight of sincerity. "Cyrus, he's had some hard years, but he's good through." She looked at the old foreman. "Why are you telling me that?" Tom put his hat back on and looked out at the evening land. "Because you look like someone who's been told a lot of things that turned out not to be true," he said, without unkindness. "Figured it might be worth mentioning when something's the straightforward version of itself." He went to the barn, and Evelyn sat on the porch and thought about that for a long while after the light had faded and the stars had come out, thick and brilliant in the New Mexico sky, in a way she had never seen in Missouri, and that filled her with something she was almost afraid to name. It was on a Tuesday evening in her 4th week at the ranch that the shape of things between Evelyn and Cyrus began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. She had been making supper, a beef stew with the dried chilies that Mrs. Marsh had recommended, and that had turned out to be one of the most genuinely warming things she had ever cooked, when she reached for the top shelf of the kitchen pantry and found it too high. She did not, under ordinary circumstances, call for help with things like this. She would have fetched the step stool from the utility room, which was what she always did. But the step stool was not in the utility room. She had seen it near the barn that morning, when one of the Salazar brothers had used it, and the pot of stew needed tending, and she did not want to leave the heat, and Cyrus had just come through the kitchen on his way to the water basin to wash his hands after the day's work. She said nothing. She stretched up on her toes, fingertips just barely catching the tin she needed. "Here." He was beside her before she processed the movement, reaching up easily and bringing down the tin with the relaxed reach of someone for whom that shelf presented no difficulty at all. He set it on the counter next to her. She took a step sideways because he was very close, and she was not accustomed to being that close to people without bracing herself. "Thank you," she said. He did not move away immediately. He stood there looking at her with that careful, unreadable expression, and she concentrated on the stew and waited for him to step back. "You always do that," he said. She glanced at him. "Do what? Step away?" She felt a prickle of self-consciousness that she quickly smoothed over. "I beg your pardon." "Not a criticism," he said, and his voice was level and not unkind. "Just an observation. You make yourself very small. You press to the edges of rooms. You always sit where you can see the door." He paused. "You don't have to do that here." She turned to look at him fully then, and the steadiness in his face was such that she could not find anything in it to be defensive about. He was simply saying a true thing in the way you say true things when you trust the other person not to misuse them. "Old habit," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just saying it's not necessary. Not here." He moved to the water basin and washed his hands, and she stood at the stove and stirred the stew and felt something lodged in her chest begin, very slowly and cautiously, like an animal testing whether it was safe to come out of hiding. After supper that evening, Cyrus did not go to the barn to review the day's work the way he usually did. He sat at the kitchen table with a surveying map and a cup of coffee, and Evelyn washed the dishes, and neither of them spoke for a long time. But it was a different kind of silence than the polite, careful silence of the previous weeks. This one had more air in it somehow. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not turning from the dishes. "Go ahead. The book's on your shelves, Don Quixote. Did you read it?" "3 times," he said. She turned then, surprised. He was looking at the map, but he glanced up at her with a faint trace of amusement. "My mother brought it from back east when she came out here. She said there were worse things to be than someone who charged windmills." "She sounds like an interesting woman." She was. He said it simply, without the elaboration of grief, but the simplicity itself carried enough weight. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "She had a good life here. She chose this place." He looked back at his map. "She used to say the land out here was honest. That you always knew exactly where you stood with it." Evelyn dried her hands on a cloth and looked at the window over the sink, the darkness outside lit only by stars. "That's either comforting or terrifying," she said. "Depending on where you're standing," he said. He glanced up again, and this time the faint amusement had become something warmer and more genuine. "Which is it for you?" She thought about it, really thought about it. "Comforting," she said slowly. "I think. It's unfamiliar, but I think it might be comforting." He nodded and went back to his map, and she put the cloth down and went to the bookshelves and took down Don Quixote and sat in the chair by the window and read until the lamp needed trimming, and it was the most peaceable evening she could remember in many years. The days moved in the rhythm of the ranch, which was the rhythm of animals and seasons, and the particular demands of a cattle operation in the New Mexico Territory in 1882. There were mornings of early hard work and afternoons of different hard work and evenings of the specific exhaustion that comes from physical labor done outdoors in a land that does not forgive carelessness. Evelyn found herself fitting into the rhythm more easily than she had expected. She had always been good at adapting to the rhythms of the places she occupied. It was another of her survival skills, but something was different here. The adaptation was not the careful, anxious fitting of herself into whatever shape was required. It was something more natural. She woke in the mornings, and the day had a shape to it that was hers as much as anyone else's. She cooked food she wanted to cook and grew vegetables in the garden with a pleasure that had nothing defensive in it. She read in the evenings, and the reading was for herself, and not a way of making herself look harmless and manageable. She noticed this slowly, the way you notice warmth after a long cold. Cyrus was in the habit of working harder than any man on the ranch, and asking no more of anyone than he asked of himself, which Evelyn thought was the true test of a man's character. He was not easy in the way of men who never exert themselves. He was direct to the point of bluntness, and had opinions about ranching and land management, and the new railroad that was snaking toward the territory that he expressed without apology, but also without aggression. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly and always caught her off guard. He was interested in things, the land, the cattle, the books, the movement of weather, with a genuine engagement that she found, increasingly, to be one of the most attractive things about a person. She did not acknowledge to herself for some time that she found him attractive. When she finally did, she sat with the realization carefully and assessed it from all angles, the way she had learned to assess things that might be dangerous. She was his employee. She was a woman who had already made one catastrophic error of judgment about a man. She was not in a position to entertain the kind of feelings that were beginning to accumulate in the quiet moments between tasks, the times when he sat near enough that she could see the particular way he frowned when he was concentrating, or the way he looked at the land in the evenings with an expression that was something close to love. She kept the feelings to herself with the ease of long practice. The incident that changed the pace of things happened in early June, when the weather had turned properly hot, and the dry heat of the territory was something you had to adjust your whole way of existing around. A man came to the ranch that Evelyn had not seen before. She was in the garden when the horse came up the track, and she straightened and watched. The rider was perhaps 40, thick through the middle, with a face that wore authority the way some men wore it, as though the world owed them its deference. He wore good clothes for a man riding out on a hot day, which told her he had not ridden far or that he wanted to make an impression. Cyrus came out of the barn and she watched the two men talk. Even from the distance of the garden, she could see the quality of Cyrus's stillness during the conversation, the particular way he held himself when something was not sitting right with him. Tom Bower appeared from the corral and stood slightly to the side, saying nothing. The man rode away after perhaps 15 minutes, and Cyrus stood watching him go for a moment before he turned and his eyes found Evelyn in the garden. He came toward her. "That was Henry Marsh," he said, "Delphine's brother-in-law." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron. "What did he want?" Cyrus looked at the departing rider who had already disappeared behind a stand of juniper. "He wants to buy this ranch," he said. "Has wanted to for 2 years. He's been trying to consolidate land in this valley, and ours sits between 2 pieces he already holds. Are you going to sell?" He looked at her with what might have been mild surprise at the directness of the question, and then seemed to decide he didn't mind it. "No," he said. "This ranch was built by my parents. I'm not selling it to Henry Marsh or anyone else." She nodded. He seemed like the kind of man who would keep asking. "He is," Cyrus said grimly. He looked at her for a moment. "He also asked who you were, said he'd heard I'd hired a woman from Missouri." "Word travels fast in a small town," Evelyn said. He made a comment. His jaw was set and he said it with care, as though choosing his next words precisely. "About it being unusual, a woman living out here alone with," his phrasing, "a man she has no connection to." Evelyn felt the familiar tightening that she had learned to recognize as the preparation for making herself smaller, fitting herself more quietly into whatever narrow space society was inclined to allow her. She waited. Cyrus looked directly at her. "I told him it was my ranch and my business and that I'd thank him to mind his own." She blinked. "Oh. I also told him that you were indispensable and had already saved us money on supplies." The faintest possible warmth around the corners of his eyes. "I thought that might irritate him." "Did it?" "Considerably." She looked at him and felt that small animal in her chest stir again, more boldly this time. "Thank you," she said. "No need," he said. "It was only the truth." She went back to her garden and he went back to the barn, and neither of them acknowledged the particular quality of the silence between them as he walked away, but it was there, and they both felt it, and it was warm. The summer deepened. The ranch settled into its hot season rhythms. The cattle moved to higher pastures where there was more grass and water, and the days were long and bright and very dry. Evelyn had begun to love the evenings in the way she had not loved evenings anywhere before. The way the heat relented as the sun moved lower. The way the sky shifted through its extraordinary progressions. The way the air took on a quality of settled peace that she was not accustomed to encountering in her daily life. She and Cyrus had fallen into the habit of sitting on the porch after supper, each with their own occupation. He with his maps or his account books, she with her reading or her mending and talking, sometimes a great deal and sometimes very little. These conversations were the kind that built gradually, each one laying a stone on top of what came before, until without quite realizing it, they had constructed something substantial and mutually inhabited. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father who had come west from Virginia before the war, and built the adobe house with his own hands, about his mother who had kept a garden in the difficult soil, and had strong opinions about irrigation. He told her about the years after his father's death when he was 17, and had taken on the management of the ranch with Tom Bower's help, the mistakes he'd made, and the things he'd learned. He told her about the territory, about the complicated web of land rights and water rights, and the ongoing tensions between the old land-grant families and the new Anglo settlers, about the Apache who had been pushed further and further by a government that had broken every agreement it made, which he spoke of with a frankness about injustice that surprised her and that she found she respected. She told him less, because she had less practice and more fear. But she told him more than she had told anyone in years. She told him about Missouri, about the boarding house and the seamstress work. She told him carefully, minimally, about her marriage, and he listened without asking questions she didn't want to answer, which was more courtesy than most people offered. She told him about the advertisement in the newspaper, how she had read it 3 times before cutting it out, how it had felt like a door in a wall she had not known had one. Harlan's Crossing as a door, he said, looking out at the evening land with amusement. I'll take it as a compliment. It was meant as one, she said. He glanced at her. In the amber evening light his face was very clear, and she looked at it for perhaps a moment longer than was prudent and looked back at her book. Evelyn, he said. She kept her eyes on the page. Yes. I want to say something. You can tell me to mind my business if you'd rather. She looked up then because there was something in his voice that required it. You've been here 2 months, he said, and every day I've watched you work harder than is required and ask for less than you're owed and make yourself as small and unobtrusive as possible, as though you're perpetually waiting for permission to simply exist in the space you're in. He paused. He was looking at her steadily and without apology. You don't need my permission. This house runs better because you're in it and you're welcome in every part of it, and I want you to know that plainly. She held very still. There was something in her that wanted to deflect or diminish or say it was nothing, really, just old habits, just practical, not worth mentioning. She recognized the impulse and recognized it as the small voice that had kept her diminished for 24 years, and she took a breath and said instead, "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." He nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his account book. And she sat in the warm evening air and felt, with a clarity that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure, that she was in real danger of falling in love with Cyrus Abbott. The danger became more concrete in the 3rd week of July, when a storm came off the mountains with the speed and violence that the territory's weather was capable of, and the afternoon turned purple-black in the time it took to bring in the washing. Evelyn was on the porch pulling down the dried linens from the line when the first crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, and the horses in the near corral screamed and shied. Cyrus was in the barn, and he came out at a run and went straight to the corral, and she watched him manage 2 panicking horses with the quiet authority of someone who had done it many times, his voice low and steady even while the sky tore itself open, and the rain came in sheets. Diego Salazar ran from the bunkhouse to help, and between them they got the horses into the barn, and Cyrus came running back to the house soaking wet, and she had the door open before he reached the porch. He came inside and stood in the entry dripping on the floorboards, pushing his soaked hair back from his face, and she handed him the dry towel she'd brought from the linen cupboard without quite thinking about it. He took it and looked at her. "You were already coming with the towel," he said. "The horses were going to spook," she said. "I knew you'd end up wet." He dried his face, and she went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and he leaned in the doorway of the kitchen, and she could feel him watching her. She put the kettle on the iron stove, and the rain hammered against the window. "Evelyn," she turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was different from any she had seen on him before. Still careful, still very Cyrus in its restraint, but underneath the restraint there was something that she recognized because she felt it too and had been carrying it carefully for weeks. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "because I think you deserve honesty more than most people I've ever known, and I think you've had less of it." She leaned back against the counter and waited. "I find myself thinking about you constantly," he said. "Not in a way that's inappropriate given our circumstances. I know what you've come from, and I have no intention of pressing you on anything. But I wanted you to know it because I think it would be dishonest not to tell you. You're the most quietly remarkable person I've ever encountered, and I would—" He stopped, and something passed across his face that was almost shy, which was so unexpected on him that it made her chest ache. "I would like very much for you to stay here, not just as the housekeeper, eventually, if you were willing, as more than that." The rain was very loud on the roof. The kettle was beginning to steam. She looked at him for a long time, and he let her look, holding her gaze with that steadiness that was perhaps the thing she found most remarkable about him. "I'm afraid," she said. She said it the way you say things when you have decided to be brave. "I'm afraid of being wrong again. I was wrong before about someone, and the cost was very high." "I know," he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just asking you to know what I'm feeling so it doesn't live in the room between us unacknowledged and make things strange." He pushed off the doorframe. "I don't need you to say anything now, or at all if that's what you decide." He moved toward the kitchen to get a cup for the tea, and she put a hand out and it landed on his forearm, which stopped him in place. "Cyrus." She kept her voice level and direct even though her heart was doing something that bore no relation to level. "I have been feeling the same way. I have been frightened of it because I've been frightened of most things most of my life, and I'm genuinely trying to stop letting the fear make decisions for me." He was very still under her hand. His eyes on her face were very dark. "I'm not asking you to rush," she said. "I just don't want you to think you misread it." He turned his arm over slowly and held her hand for a moment very gently, as though it were something precious and fragile, and then released it. "We'll go slowly," he said. "Yes," she said, "but clearly." "Yes," she said again, and meant it absolutely. He got his cup and she made the tea, and the rain hammered on and the lightning walked across the mesas, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked until the storm had passed, and she thought she could feel the shape of her life shifting, slowly and fundamentally, like a river that had found a new course. Going slowly meant something different in the territory in 1882 than it might have meant in a city, because the circumstances of living were intimate and immediate in ways that the city managed with more architecture. They were in the same house, eating the same meals, sharing the same evenings. Slow, in this context, meant honest. It meant careful. It meant real. He began to let her see more of him, not performatively but naturally, the way trust opens. She saw him lose his temper once briefly, when he discovered that a supplier had been short measuring the grain, and she watched him manage his own anger with deliberate control, dealing with the matter directly and without cruelty, and then letting it go. She saw him with the Salazar brothers, the easy and genuine respect with which he treated them, the way he defended their wages to Henry Marsh's agent who came sniffing around in August and suggested that perhaps the help was being overpaid. She heard the conversation from the kitchen window and heard Cyrus's voice go flat and precise in the way it did when he meant something completely. "Diego and Luis Salazar are worth every cent I pay them, and I pay them the same I'd pay any man doing that work, and that's the end of this conversation." She heard the agent's horse leave at some speed. She began to let him see her in return. She told him more about Missouri, about her father's house, about the things that had made her what she was. She told him in the careful, selective way that people who have not been safe tell things, piece by piece, testing each piece before laying down the next. He listened with a consistency of attention that she was learning to trust, never minimizing and never dramatizing, just receiving what she said with the quiet gravity it deserved. There was the evening she told him about her marriage, the real version of it, more than she had said before. She had been sitting with her knees drawn up in the porch chair, and the night was very close and starry, and she told him about the way her husband had not used fists but had used other things, silence and control and the steady erosion of everything that was hers. When she finished, she was looking at the stars and her jaw was very tight. Cyrus said, after a long moment, "You got yourself out." "Yes," she said, "that took more courage than anything he ever did." She blinked hard once. "I didn't feel courageous. I felt terrified." "Those two things coexist all the time," he said. "Out here especially." She looked at him. He was looking at the stars too, his profile in the lamplight from the window very steady and certain, and she thought, this is a man who has lived his whole life in honest relationship with difficulty. Not untouched by it, not hardened by it, but genuinely shaped by it into something solid and trustworthy. "Cyrus," she said, "can I ask you something forward?" He turned his head to look at her. "Always. Why haven't you?" She searched for the right words. "Mrs. Marsh said you weren't looking for a wife. Tom said you'd had hard years. Why haven't you? Why am I still alone at 28? A short, honest exhalation of breath. "Because I spent 3 years watching this ranch almost go under after my father died, and I had no room for anything else. Then my mother got sick, and the last 18 months of her life I was trying to run the ranch and take care of her. Then she passed, and I hired help and started to have room again." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm also not easy," he said. "I know that. I'm direct to the point of bluntness, and I have a temper I work to manage, and I'm very attached to this land in a way that doesn't leave room for compromise. I've been told those are difficult qualities in a man." "Those are not the qualities that make men difficult," she said. He looked at her. "What makes men difficult," she said carefully, "is when they decide that the people around them belong to them, when they confuse caring for someone with owning them. Everything you just described is simply who you are, which is either compatible with another person or it isn't. It's not difficult. It's honest." He was very still and looking at her with an intensity that she held without flinching, which was new for her, the not flinching. "You're extraordinary," he said. She felt warmth flood her from the sternum outward. "I'm really not," she said. "That's what makes it remarkable," he said. A week later he kissed her for the first time on the porch in the early evening with the sun going down behind the mesas, a kiss that was careful and asking, and then, when she answered it, sure. She had both hands pressed flat against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat, which was not as steady as his face suggested, and that undid something in her completely, the evidence that he was not as collected as he appeared, that she had the same effect on him that he had on her, that they were equal in this. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, and she closed her eyes. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. He smiled, which was not something she had seen him do fully before, the real version of it, and it changed his whole face in a way that she thought she would spend a great deal of time in the future trying to cause. In September, Henry Marsh made his third and most serious attempt to acquire the ranch, this time through legal pressure. He had apparently found a surveying discrepancy from 30 years back that put a corner of the Abbott land in some ambiguity, and he engaged a lawyer from Santa Fe to make the case that the land title was clouded. This was not an uncommon tactic in the territory in 1882, where land law was still being written, and powerful men had learned that confusion and paperwork could accomplish what outright force could not. Cyrus came to supper that evening with his jaw set, and the surveying manual from the shelf already open on the table. Evelyn put food in front of him and looked at the maps he had spread out and said, "Tell me what they're claiming." He looked up. "You don't need to be involved in this." "I can read a survey and I can read legal documents," she said. "Tell me what they're claiming." He told her. She sat down across from him and pulled the nearest map toward her, and they worked through it together over the course of that evening and the next two, Evelyn cross-referencing the original land patent documents against the newer survey, her careful accountant's eye finding the place where the discrepancy had been manufactured rather than discovered. "Here," she said on the third evening, pointing to a date on one of the survey documents. "This resurvey is dated 1879, which is after New Mexico's Land Survey Commission produced their standardized benchmarks. But this surveyor's notation references landmarks that existed before 1860 and disappeared in the drought of 1864. He couldn't have used them in 1879. Either this survey was backdated or it was done by someone who copied an old document and changed the date." Cyrus looked at the document, looked at her. "You found that. It's there to be found." He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she was learning was one of his most fundamental ones, the one that was equal parts admiration and something deeper and more personal. "I need to get this to a lawyer," he said, "in Santa Fe. I can write up the discrepancy clearly for you," she said, "with the relevant dates and references marked. It would save the lawyer time." "Evelyn," his voice was very warm. "I'm going to write it up," she said, already reaching for the pen. He watched her begin to write, and she heard him exhale slowly in a way that she had come to recognize as him feeling something he was managing with the same deliberate care he managed everything. And she concentrated on the document and let her heart do what it wanted privately. Tom Bauer drove her and Cyrus to Santa Fe 2 weeks later in the ranch wagon, a journey of 2 days there and 2 days back, through landscape that Evelyn was still not accustomed to and was not sure she ever would be, in the sense that it was too large and too beautiful to become ordinary. They stayed at a respectable hotel, and the lawyer they found, a young Mexican-American man named Rodrigo Vega who had a sharp mind and genuine command of territorial land law, read through Evelyn's documentation with increasing satisfaction. "This is excellent work," he said, looking at her. "You drew this up." "I did," she said. He glanced at Cyrus with a faint smile. "You hired a lawyer without knowing it." Cyrus looked at Evelyn with an expression she felt in the base of her chest. "I know exactly what I hired," he said. The case against Marsh's claim was filed the following week. It was resolved by December in the Abbott Ranch's favor, the fraudulent survey thrown out, the land title confirmed and clarified. Henry Marsh sent no further representatives to the ranch. Tom Bauer celebrated this outcome with a level of satisfaction that expressed itself in a rare grin, and the opening of a bottle of whiskey he had apparently been saving for a significant occasion. Through the autumn, Evelyn and Cyrus moved in the slow and genuine way of people who are being careful with something important. There were evenings of conversation that went past midnight, and the first time she let him take her hand across the kitchen table after supper, which was such a small thing, and yet so large to her that she had to breathe through it carefully. There was a Sunday when they rode out together to the upper pastures on the excuse of checking the cattle, and spent 3 hours talking on a hillside with the autumn land spread below them. The grass is gone gold and the sky enormous, and he told her about his plans for the ranch, the improvements he wanted to make, the irrigation system he'd been designing to bring more water from the creek, and she found herself making suggestions that were purely for the pleasure of thinking through problems with him. And he received them with the engaged seriousness that was one of the things she loved most about him. She had begun to use that word internally, not with any conclusion attached to it, just as a fact she was becoming familiar with. There was also, that autumn, the matter of her father. She received a letter in October, forwarded through the Missouri boarding house to the Harlan's Crossing post office. Mrs. Marsh gave it to her with a look that was carefully neutral. The letter was from a woman named Judith, who had been a neighbor in the Missouri town where Evelyn had grown up, and it said that her father had fallen ill and was unlikely to recover. It did not ask her to come. It was simply information. She sat with the letter for a day before she told Cyrus about it. He listened in the way he listened to things that were complicated without rushing to provide an answer. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm not sure if that makes me a bad person." He considered this honestly. A parent who causes serious harm to their child is not owed forgiveness by that child, he said. You are not obligated to grieve in any particular way for a person who hurt you. He paused. But if there's any part of you that needs to go, for your own peace, I'll take you. She looked at him. You would do that? Of course. She thought about it for several more days. She thought about the Missouri town and the house with the creaking floorboards, and the man who had filled it with a particular quality of threat that she had spent her whole adult life trying to outrun. She thought about whether seeing him sick and small would give her anything she needed. She wrote a brief reply to Judith saying she would not be coming, but asked to be informed when the matter was concluded. She sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Marsh to send, and felt, over the following days, a complicated grief that was not for the person her father had been, but for the father he had never managed to be, for the childhood that might have existed in some other version of her life. She cried once, alone in her room, with the door closed, and then she got up and washed her face and went back to work. In November, her father died. Judith's second letter told her so. She read it in the kitchen and folded it and sat with it for a moment and felt the expected grief and the unexpected relief and the complicated texture of a wound that had existed so long it had become part of the structure of her. Cyrus found her sitting at the kitchen table with the letter, and he sat down across from her without saying anything. "He's gone," she said. "I know," he said. He had seen the letter from Missouri on the table. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to know right now." She looked at him, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most, the one that was just simple, steady presence, no demands and no expectations, just him being there in the room with her with his whole attention. "I think I feel free," she said, slowly and with some wonder at the word. "And I feel guilty for feeling free. And I feel grief for the things that never happened and could never have happened with someone like him. And I feel—" She stopped. "What?" He said gently. "I feel glad I'm here," she said. "I feel glad I got on that stagecoach. I feel glad about where I ended up." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "So am I." And he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, warm and sure. And she looked at their hands together on the kitchen table and thought that she had spent 24 years making herself small enough to survive, and that here, in this house, in this particular piece of New Mexico territory, with this particular man, she did not feel small at all. She felt exactly the right size. Winter came to the territory with a quiet cold that was different from Missouri cold, drier and thinner, and at night lit by the extraordinary stars. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms, the cattle brought down to the lower pastures, the days shorter and the evenings longer, more time in the warmth of the house. Evelyn had, by this point, been at the ranch for 8 months. She had ceased to feel like an employee navigating someone else's space, and felt entirely as though the space was partly hers, in the way that belonging to a place creates its own gradual ownership. She knew every corner of the house and the garden and the area of the ranch she regularly moved through. She was known in Harlan's Crossing now, spoken to by name when she came to town, included in the small social fabric of the settlement. Mrs. Marsh had become something approaching a friend. She joined in the preparations for the Thanksgiving gathering at the church, which was a community occasion of some warmth, and sat next to Cyrus at the long tables and felt the particular pleasure of being known somewhere, of being part of a place. On a December evening, 3 days before Christmas, with snow on the mesas and a fire in the hearth, and the smell of pine boughs she had cut for decoration filling the house, Cyrus asked her to sit down at the kitchen table after supper. He had a look on his face that she recognized as the one he wore when he had something to say that he'd been thinking about carefully. She sat. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. She had learned to do this too in the past months, to invite directness rather than bracing against it. He looked at her steadily. "I told you in July that I wanted you to stay as more than the housekeeper. I want to be more specific now." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have been falling in love with you since approximately the evening you told me that the land here was unfamiliar but probably comforting, and every conversation we've had since has made it more true." He held her gaze. "I want to ask you to marry me. But I want to ask you honestly, which means I also want you to know that I would rather have you here and unmarried and mine in the ways that matter than push you towards something you're not ready for." He paused. "I know what marriage has meant to you before. I know it's not a small thing to trust again. And I need you to know that I understand that, and I'm not asking out of any need for things to be formal. I'm asking because I want you to be my wife in the full sense of it, partner and equal in person who lives here because she has chosen to and not because she has to." The fire crackled. Snow was falling past the window, visible in the lamplight, soft and unhurried. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. She was aware of the weight of what he was asking and the weight of what she had survived to arrive at this moment. And she thought about all the years of making herself small, of choosing the wall seat and the quiet answer and the unnecessary apology, of shrinking away from spaces she was entitled to occupy. She thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach in April, the one with $12 in her hem and a clipped newspaper advertisement, and the careful, exhausted resolve to start over in whatever modest way was available to her. She thought about how she had not, even in her most hopeful imaginings, pictured this. A man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and who looked at her not despite who she was but because of it. "You said," she began, and her voice was very steady, "that you needed someone to manage this house so you could manage the ranch." He watched her. "You said you needed someone capable and honest and practical, and I thought when you said that those were the smallest possible requirements. The most basic useful things." "Yes," he said, "and now you're telling me," she said, "that what you need is me, specifically." His expression was the warmest she had ever seen it. "What I'm telling you," he said, "is that I couldn't need anyone more specifically if I had drawn up a list and designed a person to meet it. You are exactly who I need. All of you. The part that reads Don Quixote and the part that finds surveying fraud and the part that grows herbs in difficult soil and the part that has been hurt and came through it and the part that is still learning to let herself have room." His voice was low and unhurried and completely certain. "I need someone exactly your size, Evelyn. I have from the start. I just didn't know to say it until now." She breathed. She thought about size. About how she had always understood her smallness as a necessity, a camouflage, a way of fitting into the spaces that were not quite built for her. She had spent her entire life trying to be small enough not to cause trouble, to not take up more than her permitted space, to exist quietly and usefully and without demand. And this man was sitting across from her in the firelight telling her that he needed her exactly as she was. Not smaller, not quieter, not more or less of anything. Exactly her. Something opened in her, wide and quiet and permanent, like a door in a wall that had been locked for a very long time. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, more certainly. "I will marry you. Not because I have to and not because I'm afraid of anything else. Because I choose to. Because I love you and you are the best man I have ever known, and this place feels like home in a way that no place has ever felt before." She reached across the table and put her hands over his. "Yes, Cyrus." He looked at her hands on his, and then at her face, and the expression he wore was the complete version of something she had been seeing in fragments for months, the full, unguarded version, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a person. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he put his arms around her in the careful and complete way of a man who is aware of the significance of what he's holding, and she put her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady and real under her ear, and the snow fell past the window and the fire burned and the house was warm around them. "I should get you a ring," he said into her hair. "You can get me a ring," she said, "but you don't need to rush." She felt him laugh, the low and genuine version of it that she had become addicted to. "I've been told I have a tendency toward slowness," he said. "In some things," she said. "In this particular matter, I don't think you've been slow at all." They were married on a Saturday in February of 1883, in the Harlan's Crossing Church with its freshly painted white walls, because the community had repainted them in December, and they were beautiful now. Mrs. Delphine Marsh stood with Evelyn in the small room behind the altar before the ceremony, doing up the last buttons of the pale blue dress that Evelyn had made herself over the preceding weeks from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, the finest thing she had ever made and the finest thing she had ever owned. "You look wonderful, Mrs." Marsh said with the particular satisfaction of someone who had played a small role in bringing something about. "Thank you for sending me to him," Evelyn said. Mrs. Marsh looked at her steadily over her spectacles. "I sent you to a job," she said. "You did the rest yourself. Never forget that." The church was full. Everyone in Harlan's Crossing and the surrounding ranches had come, which was the nature of small communities in the territory. A wedding was a community event, a shared celebration of something that was good and worth celebrating. Tom Bauer sat in the front pew looking more solemn than usual, which was his version of profoundly moved. Diego and Luis Salazar were scrubbed to a shine and grinning in equal measure. Rodrigo Vega, who had ridden up from Santa Fe for the occasion because Cyrus had written to him as a friend rather than just a lawyer, sat near the back and smiled at Evelyn as she came down the aisle. Cyrus was standing at the altar in his best clothes, which were still practical rather than ornate because that was who he was. And when Evelyn walked toward him, his face did the thing it did when he felt something fully. She watched it happen and walked toward it without looking down or to the side, walking with the posture of someone who was taking up exactly the space they were entitled to. The minister's words were the traditional ones, the ones spoken over every couple in every church in the territory, but Cyrus had asked permission to add a few words of his own at the close, which the minister had granted with a mildly surprised permission. He held Evelyn's hands and looked at her and said, in a voice that was quiet but carried in the silent church, "I want everyone here to know that this woman is the most genuinely capable, honest, and remarkable person I have ever met. And I want her to know that for as long as I am breathing, she will never need to make herself small for anyone. Not for me, not for this town, not for anyone on this earth. She is exactly the right size." She felt the tears come and let them, which was another new thing she had learned, that you could feel things fully without being undone by them. She said her vows in a clear and steady voice, and he said his with the directness that was essential to him. And when it was done and they were married, she took his arm and they walked back down the aisle together and out into the February cold and the brilliant New Mexico sun. And the whole town cheered. And Evelyn Covington, Evelyn Abbott, raised her face to the sky and felt, with a completeness that was almost dizzying, entirely and beautifully free. The spring that followed their marriage was the most vivid of Evelyn's life. Everything had more color in it. Not literally, she understood that was in her own perception. But the world presented itself with an intensity that she attributed to being, for the first time, genuinely safe and genuinely happy. She woke in the mornings in the room that was now hers by right, and not just by arrangement, with Cyrus's warmth beside her, and the early light coming through the window, and the ordinary quality of this domestic peace was so foreign to anything she had previously experienced that she sometimes lay still for several minutes simply absorbing it. She expanded into the house, the way plants expand toward light when the shade is removed. She rearranged the main room to her taste, and Cyrus observed this with visible pleasure. She planted an expanded garden with the ambition of someone who was planning on being somewhere permanently. She started a kitchen herb bed that became one of the most productive features of the ranch operation, supplying not only their own table, but eventually a small trade with the hotel in Harlan's Crossing that added a modest income. She took over the full account books and reorganized the ranch finances with an efficiency that impressed even Tom Bauer, who had been managing his own corner of the finances for 15 years. Cyrus began his irrigation project in the spring, the one he had been designing for 2 years. She helped him draft the plan and draft the letters to the suppliers and manage the labor costs, and they worked together in the evenings at the kitchen table with maps and figures spread between them and cups of coffee going cold. And she thought that this was what genuine partnership looked like. Not the thing she had been taught about marriage, which was that a woman's role was to recede into the needs of a household. But this, two people working together in honest collaboration on the things that mattered. She found that she had opinions about the irrigation system. Genuine, technically grounded opinions, based on her reading of the natural philosophy books from his shelves and her observation of how the land held and released water. She expressed them, and he engaged with them seriously, and twice her observations changed his approach to a problem, and the satisfaction of that was something she had never expected to find in herself. In May, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Cyrus, not from fear or hesitation, but simply because she needed to be alone with it first, to feel the full dimensions of it in private before it became shared. She had not expected to have children. She had not been sure, given her history, that she was capable of wanting them. But sitting in the garden in the warm May afternoon with the knowledge settling into her, she found that what she felt was a complicated and overwhelming joy. She told him that evening on the porch. He was very still for a moment, and then he reached for her hand and held it and looked at her with an expression so full that she almost had to look away. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I feel fine, I feel wonderful actually." He let out a long, slow breath. "A baby," he said. "Sometime in December, I think," she said. "Give or take." He looked at their joined hands and then at the land and then at her, and he said, "We should make the back room into a proper nursery. I was thinking we could extend the porch and add another room on that side before the summer's out." She laughed, which surprised him and then made him smile. "You just found out and you're already planning the extension." "I'm a rancher," he said. "I plan ahead." She squeezed his hand. "Then plan ahead. I'll tell you exactly how I want that room arranged." "Obviously," he said, with the warmth that was entirely his. Tom Bauer received the news with the gravity of a man who had watched Cyrus grow up from a 17-year-old trying to keep a ranch together, and shook Cyrus's hand with both of his own, and then turned to Evelyn and said, simply, "This is a good thing," with the sincerity of someone who had thought about it and was certain. Diego and Luis Salazar were considerably less reserved, Diego whooping and Luis immediately beginning to argue about what the baby's name should be, which made Evelyn laugh until she had to sit down. The summer was long and productive. Cyrus completed the first section of the irrigation system, which brought reliable water to the lower field and made an immediate difference to the summer grazing. Evelyn ran the house and the accounts and the expanded garden and ate whatever she wanted from it, and grew larger in the unhurried way of a woman who is well-fed and unafraid, which was not something she had ever expected to be. She had a friendship by that summer that she had also not expected, or rather had not believed herself capable of, being unused to them. A woman named Clara Torres had moved to Harlan's Crossing with her husband the previous autumn, a young couple from a Mexican family in Santa Fe, her husband taking over the blacksmithing operation from the retiring old smith. Clara was 22 and quick and funny, and had almost immediately taken Evelyn into an orbit of friendship that felt natural and warm. They had Sunday afternoon visits, alternating between the ranch and the Torres house in town, and Clara was the first person in Evelyn's adult life whom she had told, fully and honestly, about her past, including her father and her first marriage, and Clara had listened with dark, furious eyes and held Evelyn's hands and said things in a mixture of English and Spanish that conveyed exactly the right combination of indignation on her behalf and recognition of her strength. "You got yourself here," Clara told her once in the direct way that was her particular style. "You made all the decisions that led you to this. Give yourself the credit." "Cyrus had something to do with it," Evelyn said. "He recognized something worth recognizing," Clara said. "But you walked through the door." On a Wednesday morning in December of 1883, in a first frost that had dusted the mesas silver, Evelyn gave birth to a son. He was born in the bedroom of the adobe house, with Clara Torres in attendance and the midwife from town, and Cyrus pacing the main room until Clara opened the door and said, "You have a son." He came into the room with the look of a man whose composure has been completely and thoroughly overcome, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, red-faced, furiously blinking person in Evelyn's arms, and the expression on his face was something Evelyn would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Hello," Cyrus said to his son, as though greeting a person of importance. Evelyn laughed tiredly. "He can't understand you yet." "He's going to learn," Cyrus said. He looked up at Evelyn and his eyes were very bright. "How are you?" "Exhausted," she said, "and very happy." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead very gently. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it," he said. They named the boy Thomas James Abbott, Thomas for Tom Bauer, who was unable to conceal that the honor affected him deeply, James for Cyrus's father. They called him Thomas, which immediately became Tom around the ranch, and within a week Diego Salazar had started calling him Pequeño Tom, Little Tom, which stuck entirely and became the name most people used for the first 2 years of his life. Tom Bower the elder stood at the christening in January with an expression of unconcealed pride and said to Cyrus, in the very quiet voice of a man who does not often say things of this nature, "Your father would have been glad to see this." Cyrus said nothing for a moment and then put a hand on the old foreman's shoulder. Little Thomas grew through his first year in the warm security of the ranch house, absorbing the voices and the rhythms of his particular world. He was a solemn and observant baby who watched everything around him with the serious dark eyes he had inherited from his father. And then, when he had decided something was acceptable, smiled with the sudden brilliance that was entirely Evelyn's. She had expected motherhood to diminish her in some way, to take the parts of herself that she had only recently recovered and reclaim them for its own needs. She found instead that it enlarged her. The love she felt for her son was physical and enormous and unqualified, and it taught her something about herself, that she had always been capable of this fullness of feeling, and that what had suppressed it before was not her nature but her circumstances. The circumstances had changed. She was allowed to take up room. Cyrus was a father in the same way he was a husband, direct and present and genuinely interested. He did not treat fatherhood as a performance or an obligation, but as a relationship, the same way he treated everything important. He talked to Thomas when Thomas could not yet respond and told him about the ranch and the land and the cattle in the same honest, factual tone he used with everyone. And Evelyn watched this from across rooms and felt an accumulation of love so large, it sometimes made her briefly dizzy. The second year of their marriage brought the completion of the full irrigation system, which transformed the lower pastures and allowed the herd to expand significantly. It brought the arrival of the railroad closer to the territory, which changed the economics of cattle ranching in ways that required adjustment and planning. And Evelyn and Cyrus did that planning together as they did everything, at the kitchen table in the evenings with the account books and the maps. Henry Marsh made no further appearances or claims, having apparently redirected his acquisition energies elsewhere. Tom Bower reported with considerable satisfaction that Marsh had encountered legal difficulties with his other land claims and was somewhat occupied with those. It brought also the discovery, in the early spring of that second year, that Evelyn was pregnant again. This time she told Cyrus the same evening, sitting on the porch in the fading afternoon with Thomas on her lap pulling earnestly at the buttons of her dress. "Again," he said, and the word carried nothing but warmth. "Is that all right?" she asked, a reflex of the old habit. He looked at her with a mild exasperation that was entirely fond. "Do not ask me if it's all right that we're having a child," he said. "Every child we have is an addition to this world that I will consider a gift." She laughed. "I know," she said, "old habit." He reached over and took her free hand. "One day," he said, "you will stop having old habits." "One day," she agreed. "Give me a little more time." "I have all the time there is," he said. Their daughter was born in October of 1885, healthy and loudly opinionated from her first moments, which Clara Torres said at the christening meant she would be either a great success or a great force of nature, and probably both. They named her Margaret Rose Abbott, Margaret for Cyrus's mother and Rose for the wild desert roses that grew along the creek bed where Evelyn liked to walk in the early mornings. They called her Maggie, and she was the most thoroughly loved child in the valley, which was saying something because Thomas already had the undivided affection of approximately 8 ranch workers and all of Harlan's Crossing. Little Thomas, who was nearly 2 when his sister arrived and had opinions about everything, inspected her with great seriousness and then announced to his father that she was small. Cyrus told him that small was just a beginning, not a permanent state, and that she would have plenty of room to grow. Thomas considered this and seemed to accept it as satisfactory. Life on the Abbott Ranch in 1886 had the quality of something that had been built slowly and honestly, and had therefore become genuinely solid. The ranch was prospering, not in the way of sudden luck, but in the way of consistent good management, and the kind of work that compounds over time. The house had been expanded. The back room was the nursery now, and then Thomas's room, and a proper second bedroom had been added for Maggie, and it felt inhabited in all its corners, warm with the accumulated presence of people who were glad to be there. Evelyn looked up one March afternoon from the account books at the kitchen table, with Maggie asleep in the other room and Thomas's voice floating in from the yard where he was helping Diego with some project appropriate to a nearly 3-year-old's participation. And she looked at the kitchen she knew perfectly, and the bookshelves visible through the doorway, and the maps Cyrus had left rolled on the table's edge, and she thought, "This is mine. This is mine, every inch of it, not by legal possession which mattered less than people pretended, but by the full weight of belonging, by the daily choice to be here and stay and grow into this place and let it grow into her." She had spent 24 years making herself small enough to fit wherever she was barely tolerated. She had learned to want nothing out loud, to apologize for the fact of her own presence, to be useful without being visible, to survive by occupying the minimum possible space. And then she had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, on a spring day in 1882, and followed a newspaper advertisement to a ranch 6 miles east of town, and met a man who had looked at her with steady, careful eyes and said not immediately, not in so many words, but in every subsequent word and action, that he needed someone exactly her size. That there was not a smaller or larger version of her that would serve better. That her particular dimensions, the precise shape of her history and her courage and her capacity and her hurt and her recovery and her intelligence and her need for honest things, were not inconveniences to be managed or liabilities to be overlooked. They were the thing itself. They were what he needed. She was exactly right. She heard the back door open and his boots on the floor, and then Cyrus came into the kitchen, pulling off his hat, and he looked at her sitting at the table with the account books, and he smiled, the full real version of it. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. He went to the water basin and washed his hands. "How's the quarter looking?" "Better than last quarter," she said. "The expanded herd is already showing in the numbers. By summer we'll have paid off the irrigation costs and have something left over." "Your analysis or the numbers analysis?" "Both, which is how you know it's correct," she said. He laughed. He dried his hands and came to the table and bent to look at the books over her shoulder, and she felt his warmth and his familiar presence and leaned back very slightly into it, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder in the easy, natural way of a man comfortable with belonging somewhere. "Thomas has been telling Diego that he wants to be in charge of the cattle when he grows up," Cyrus said. "Diego says he'd better learn to ride properly first. Thomas says he can already ride. He can sit on a horse while the horse stands still," Evelyn said. "I think he's extrapolating." "He gets that from you," Cyrus said. "The confidence." She looked up at him. "Is that what you think, that he gets his confidence from me?" He looked at her. "Yes. Where else would it come from?" She thought about this. She thought about the woman she had been at 24, boarding that stagecoach with $12 and an old clipping and the kind of quiet, desperate courage that does not announce itself. She thought about what it meant for her son to have her as a model of something, of how entirely improbable that was, and how completely she was going to honor it. "Then I'm glad," she said. Maggie's voice came from the back room, the particular demanding cry of a child who had woken from a nap and had views about the situation. Cyrus was already moving toward the sound. "I have her," he said. "I'll get supper started," she said. She heard him talking to their daughter as he went down the hallway, the same unhurried, direct, honest voice he used with everyone. She heard Maggie's cry moderate as she was picked up, and then the sound of Cyrus's voice continuing, and Maggie making the responding noises of a small person being talked to with genuine attention. She stood at the stove and began supper in the warm late afternoon of a New Mexico spring, with the sounds of her family in the house around her, and the land outside the window spread in its endless, honest beauty, and she felt, She held the feeling fully and let it be as large as it was. Let it take up all the room it needed. She felt like herself. The full, actual, undiminished version of herself. The woman who had always been there, behind the careful smallness, waiting for a place where she was allowed to exist in her real proportions. She was not waiting anymore. The evening came in over the mesas in its slow, magnificent way, all amber and rose and the pure blue darkening above it. And Cyrus came back into the kitchen with Maggie on his hip, still talking to her. And Thomas came running in from outside with mud on his boots and Diego following to apologize for the boots. And the kitchen filled with noise and warmth and the particular comfortable chaos of a household that is genuinely alive. And Evelyn stood at the stove and looked at all of it and held it inside her and was not afraid of any of it at all. There would be more years after this, years she could not yet see from where she stood. More seasons on this land she had come to love with the depth of someone who had not known they were capable of loving a place. Thomas would grow into the confident, serious, big-hearted boy that his parents' care had made him, learning to ride properly and then brilliantly, learning the land and the cattle and the accounts with equal interest. Maggie would be exactly the force of nature Clara Torres had predicted, fierce and warm, and absolutely incapable of making herself small for anyone, which Evelyn considered the greatest possible gift she could give a daughter. There would be a third child, another son, born in 1888, named William Diego Abbott William for Evelyn's grandfather, who had been the only member of her family she remembered with uncomplicated love. Diego for the man who had been part of the ranch from before the beginning, and who received this honor with a stunned, speechless emotion that took him several minutes to recover from. Tom Bauer would retire in 1890, and Cyrus would give him a small piece of land adjacent to the ranch, where he built himself a simple house, and continued to come to supper most Wednesdays, because the habit was too well established to break. Clara Torres would have 2 children of her own, and she and Evelyn would grow into the kind of friendship that makes a life structurally stronger. 2 women who had both navigated the complicated terrain of existing as women in a place and time that did not always make it easy, and who had found in each other the specific companionship of people who understand each other's histories. The territory would become a state eventually, the laws would change, the land would be measured and remeasured, and its history written and rewritten as histories are. The injustices of that history would remain, the displaced families, the broken agreements with the Apache and the Navajo, the land taken from the old Mexican families who had held it before the Anglo tide came, and Evelyn and Cyrus would not pretend otherwise. They would tell their children the true history of the land they stood on, and they would be neighbors, where they could, with the honesty that required. But on this evening in March of 1886, none of that future was visible yet. There was only the kitchen and the stove and the man coming in with the baby and the boy with mud on his boots, and the land outside the window going gold in the last light, and Evelyn at the center of all of it, taking up exactly the space she deserved. Cyrus caught her eye across the kitchen, over Thomas's head, and looked at her with the expression she had first seen fully on the porch on an evening in December, 3 years past, when he had told her what she was to him. It had not diminished with time. She thought it had increased. She looked back at him with the same thing, her own version of it, the full and undefended version, the one she had been afraid to show anyone for so long and was no longer afraid of at all. She had spent her life making herself small enough to survive. He had looked at her, the actual her, the full dimensions of her, the courage and the hurt and the capability and the stubbornness and the love she had always had in her that had simply never had a safe place to go, and he had said, in word and in deed and in every honest day of their life together, "I need someone exactly your size." And she had discovered that her size was, after all, exactly right. The supper cooked and the lamp was lit, and the family gathered at the table in the warm adobe house on the edge of the New Mexico territory. and the stars came out over the mesas in their thousands. And Evelyn Abbott was, in every possible dimension, entirely herself. And it was enough. And it was everything. And it was home.